good morning, and thanks so much for joining. My name is Bronwyn Powell, and I'm happy to be part of ADB's webinar today, jointly hosted by the Asian Development Bank and the Pacific Water and Wastewater Association. So I'm joining today as the WASH advisor and team leader of the ADB TA on strengthening WASH practices and hygiene behaviour change in the Pacific. Today, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining from, the Yagara and Turrbal people of Brisbane in Australia. And also, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. To kick us off, I'd like to give the floor to Leah Gutierrez, who's the Director General for Asia Development Bank Pacific Department. And you can see on the screen there the role of the day. So we'll move on to presentations and then a Q&A session and then closing remarks by ADB. But over to you, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. So good day and good evening to all our participants, our colleagues from government agencies, partner utilities, and colleagues from ADB and other organizations. On behalf of the ADB, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on Citywide Inclusive Sanitation, or CWIS. This is our 11th Pacific WASH webinar in a series, and all past webinar materials are actually available online. If you go to our website, to our webpage, you can actually find the link to our past webinar materials and videos, okay? Please allow me to also recognize the Pacific Water and Wastewater Association, who co-organized the WASH webinars with us in coordination with our water utilities, line ministries, development partners, and academic institutions. ADB is really very pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to advancing knowledge, learning activities, and facilitating sector professionals coming together through the Pacific WASH webinar series. Together, we can achieve more. Now, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're all in the same sector, and there is a global sanitation crisis. In the Pacific region, there is limited data available to estimate the percentage of the population with access to safely managed sanitation services. But with more informal settlements that are not yet receiving basic services, we know the coverage for sanitation is low. Of the 21 Pacific countries, only 5, and those are PNG, Tuvalu, Tonga, and Samoa, and Kiribati, have sufficient data to estimate the percentage of the population with access to a safely managed sanitation service. Having reliable data is an important first step to knowing the scale of the problem and then monitoring progress. Now, adopting citywide inclusive sanitation principles, which is the focus of today's webinar, will significantly help address the sanitation gap in the Pacific. We have learned that traditional urban sanitation projects are not effectively reaching the poor. That is, sewerage networks and centralized wastewater treatment plants tend to serve richer urban residents. Urban sanitation projects will therefore need to be more responsive by adopting a mix of technical solutions. We are advocating to introduce complementary on-site sanitation schemes to close gaps and make sure we reach everyone, especially the most vulnerable and underserved. Governments will also need to analyze and create an effective enabling environment and implement the appropriate institutional, financial, regulatory, and social considerations to address specific sanitation problems, and also leverage resources by partnering with the private sector as much as possible in delivering sanitation services. In ADB, our operational units and the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department are working together to promote more livable cities in the Pacific. The paradigm shift that we are taking, aligned with that in the Pacific approach, is to apply holistic and integrated approaches in the planning and design of urban sanitation strategies. Infrastructure development in urban centers is geared to be more efficient, reliable, financially sustainable, inclusive, and last but not the least, climate resilient. In closing, I look forward to hearing new ideas from all of you today, and I wish all participants, all of us, a very fruitful discussion that will inform our efforts to collectively build an inclusive and sustainable sanitation sector together. At the end of this session, I would like to request you to please let us know, to give us your feedback on today's session. And we look forward to working closely with you to advance the citywide inclusive sanitation agenda in the Pacific together. So together, we are stronger, and together, we really will be working together. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction and setting the scene for us, Leah. Next, I'd like to invite Penny Dutton to give a presentation on the principles of citywide inclusive sanitation. So Penny has over 25 years of experience in social, gender and community development on water supply, sanitation and hygiene projects. She's recently worked on WASH assignments in Asia Pacific for World Bank, ADB and others, and has a master's degree in social planning and development and a graduate certificate in health promotion. And she's also joining from Brisbane. Over to you, Penny.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that's come up okay. So what I'd like to do now is just briefly explain some of the basics of citywide inclusive sanitation, and perhaps demystify it. I think in our sector sometimes we have jargon, and it's helpful.
Sorry, Penny, do you mind having your camera on if you can?
Oh, okay, sure.
Thanks.
I think it's helpful to have it explained a little bit. So we're going to cover the urban sanitation challenge and looking at trends of urbanisation and what the challenge is, and then look at what's happened in the past in responding to these challenges, what needs to change, and then a little bit about what is CWIS. So Asia and Pacific cities are growing rapidly, and by 2030, more than 55% of the region's population will live in urban areas, and there will be huge increases in the number of people living in cities and towns. And in the Pacific, it's interesting that nearly every country has an urban growth rate which is higher than the population increase, which means that there's a lot of increase in the urban population through migration, people coming from rural areas into towns and cities and outer islands. And that urban growth rate is particularly high in Melanesia and Solomons and Papua New Guinea in particular. And it's not just the capital cities that we need to think about. This chart from UN Habitat shows the population growth between 1990 and 2014, and we can see that in the blue that the population in informal settlements, well, as a proportion of the urban population has fallen, but in total numbers, the number of people has increased massively. So it's gone up from 700 million to 900 million in our region. City development can take many forms, and as you can see in this photo from Suva, that there are dense informal settlements amongst lower density, more formal settlements. Combining that population, the urban growth, with higher population densities and expansion of urban areas, that means that managing large amounts of human waste is becoming ever more challenging. So the lack of sanitation can have significant impacts on the quality of life, city and national economies, investment, productivity and competitiveness of urban areas, water resources and environment through pollution, real estate values. I mean, who wants to live in an area next to, you know, an open sewer or leaking septic tanks? It's hard to sell that property. And public health, of course. And in the Pacific in particular, I think there's tourism is something we need to think about and the impacts on that. Having poor sanitation is a deterrent for tourism, and perhaps Hilson might mention a bit more about that. There's a wide range of physical and socio-economic conditions in different parts of nearly every city and town, and that means that there's no one size that fits all sanitation solution. And as Leah mentioned, a full range of technical and institutional options needs to be available to provide sanitation services for all. So as we can see in Port Moresby here, there's a traditional urban village out over water, which presents a very specific challenge for sanitation, very challenging environment. And we have high-rise buildings up on the hills, residential areas, and then there's also urban sprawl and pockets of informal settlements. So there's not going to be one solution that fits that. Challenges in providing sanitation to low-income areas can include lack of tenure, particularly land tenure in the Pacific, a poor access to municipal services, particularly water, which is needed if you're going to have a sewerage system, houses made of non-permanent materials, high density, but particularly in the Pacific, high levels of occupancy. So there's a lot of people often in one household. Low incomes, and again in the Pacific, there's also high cost of materials often for sanitation. So that makes affordability even more difficult. And multi-storey dwellings, but that's more of a problem in Asia. So in the past, governments and development partners have invested immense amounts of money in urban sanitation programs, but these have been mostly for centralized wastewater treatment and sewerage, which don't serve everybody. There's been weak poverty targeting, so we're not addressing people in informal settlements who often have either very poor quality sanitation or none at all. There's been limited involvement of the private sector. There's not been enough investment in regulations, institutions, and human resources. So the cities often lack the human or financial resources to operate and manage conventional sanitation, and the situation's even worse for fecal sludge management, which often falls maybe not to the utility, but to maybe local governments, city councils, or even departments of health. And there's been a very poor track record of long-term operation and maintenance of sewers and wastewater treatment plants, which means that only a small amount of fecal waste ends up being treated. So what needs to change? Well, governments and development partners really need to rethink the approach and investment priorities for sanitation. All people need to get access to safe and reliable sanitation infrastructure and use it. Sanitation services need to be sustainable. There needs to be city and national policy, strategies and investments along the entire sanitation service chain. So from containment, from the toilet through to emptying, if it's a septic tank, or through a sewer system, treatment, and then the final disposal, which could be for agricultural uses or other disposal. Institutions may need to be restructured and regulations passed to accommodate a citywide inclusive approach, and systems need to be in place to monitor sanitation service performance. So what is CWIS? So it's really an evolving concept which aims to effectively meet the sanitation challenges of growing cities. And if we think of the concept as like a house, then the roof is the desired impact, which is improvements to public health, reduced environmental impacts from human waste disposal, and positive economic impacts such as business investment and tourism. So we can achieve that impact if the outcome is addressed, which is that everyone in an urban area has access to and benefits from sustainable sanitation services along the entire sanitation service chain. So there are 4 elements underneath that. There's capable institutions, safety and reliability, equity and inclusion, and sustainability. And within those, there are different sub-elements as well. So for example, in the institutional arrangements, we need to look at the entire sanitation service chain to ensure that everyone has a clear mandate, that there's proper funding, and that the services are monitored, and also that the politicians want to get behind sanitation and also support investments. The how forms the foundation of the CWIS house. So this is what you do to achieve those other elements, and you use evidence. An incremental approach to sanitation. It's not possible to do everything at once, so you have to decide and prioritise and look at the gaps and where the needs are. Sanitation has to be coordinated with other urban services such as water supply, drainage. Community engagement and behaviour change are critical, and we want to move beyond just this awareness of sanitation. How do we change people's behaviour? Capacity building for the public and private sector institutions so that they can do what they are meant to be doing. And then integrate sanitation into long-term urban planning. So in summary, citywide inclusive sanitation is evidence-based. It includes all citizens. It addresses the entire sanitation service chain. It involves a mix of technologies. It's linked to other urban services and urban planning. And it builds institutional capacity, accountability, and financing. It's not based on assumptions, and it's not about building infrastructure only. And it's not just looking at one part of the sanitation service chain. And it's not just serving people in informal settlements. So it's sort of everything. I wanted to just maybe show you an example of CWIS in practice. So I've been involved with some work in Kiribati, and during the mid-2020 to really mid-2021, I was part of a team that looked at updating a sanitation roadmap that was prepared in 2010. And this is, of course, during COVID, which was a challenging time to be working on an assignment like this, but we had support from some very good local consultants, and I see Bettero's on the call today. He was very active and helped a lot. So one of the things in this project was the use of evidence. So this is a fecal waste flow diagram which shows how waste is generated and where it goes to. And this helps identify where the problems are, the main problems. So to get this information, we looked at survey data, we consulted with people in Kiribati, information from focus group discussions, and then we did the best calculation we could of where waste is going. So we can see from this that 26% of waste is is from open defecation. So it's in the environment, it's not being safely managed, and that's quite a high number. And that on-site sanitation is also a real problem. So not only is the waste a large proportion not actually being treated properly contained, some of it has been collected, but only a very small proportion. And we can see that 33% of waste there is not even contained properly. So it's a big environmental problem. The other thing that we did was look at a social development indicator survey and disaggregate data on access to sanitation by wealth quintile. So in the chart on the right here, we can see that the lowest income quintile has the least access to sanitation. So nearly 70% of the lowest income quintile are open defecating. So this is evidence which helps form the decisions for the design of the project. So then we've looked at how can we support the very poorest to get access. The World Bank has now taken on the design of the South Tarawa sanitation project that's currently underway at the moment, and that involves a smaller section, not all villages in South Tarawa. So again, they've had to prioritise based on the budget. So if we just look at what some of the features, the CWIS features have been in the current World Bank project, we're looking at inclusiveness and accessibility. So toilets for the poorest households are being provided. We're looking at accessible communal facilities. So where there's community toilets or public toilets, making sure that they're disability accessible. Looking at affordability through tariffs and other cost mechanisms. A mix of sanitation, so it's not actually extending the sewerage system, but increasing the number of connections, so that making sure that everybody within the sewerage area are connected. But also looking at on-site sanitation, better quality septic tanks, pit latrines in some places, and again, communal facilities in some very poor communities. For the institutional capacity, there's provision for strengthening the capacity of the utility for operations and maintenance, and that includes purchasing equipment which will allow them to do things like desludging in areas which before couldn't be reached by vacuum trucks. So on the photograph on the bottom left there is a narrow walkway through to houses, and if, with a motorbike and a trailer you can actually get down there and empty someone's septic tank. So we're thinking through where all the gaps are and where the needs are. In the institutional, they're also looking at financing operations and maintenance and the tariff structure and different subsidies that will be needed, and management arrangements for communal facilities to make sure that they're properly operated and cleaned and repaired as necessary. A monitoring system, and also behaviour change communications and community engagement. So there's many elements of the CWIS approach that are included in this project. Yeah, that's it from me. Look forward to our
Thank you. Thanks, Penny. We've got a flurry of questions already coming in, so I think you've triggered a lot of interesting discussions that we're going to have. But next we'll move on to Mark. Now, if you stop sharing, I think Mark will start sharing his slides, Penny. So Mark Ellery is an independent water sanitation local governance consultant. He's based in Western Australia, in Fremantle, and has more than 20 years of experience in the water sector. He has a good understanding of the application of policies, projects and behaviour change in low, middle and high income countries. And today will help us understand building that evidence base that Penny was just describing, particularly looking at how fecal flow diagrams are built and how to understand them, and then understanding the risks and making decisions based on that evidence. over to you. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Today, I'm just going to briefly run through the construction or the utility of fecal flow diagrams. Fecal flow diagrams are really both an assessment and diagnostic tool that enable us to deal with on-site sanitation with water-based systems where effluent's disposed of on-site and then the sludge is disposed of off-site. Also enables us to quantify on-site sanitation where effluent's disposed of on-site and sludge is also disposed of on-site. And then network systems where both the effluent and the sludge are disposed of off-site. What we do know from the JMP is we do have data for the, I'll just hide that screen. We do have data for the Pacific looking at the percentage of countries with basic sanitation under 60%, under 70%, under 80%, 90%, and then there's a raft of countries with sanitation between 90 and 100% basic sanitation. Now that is the access to a facility, but as Leah mentioned, we've only got 5 countries in the Pacific where we have estimates for the percentage of sanitation that's safely managed. Fecal flow diagrams help us to unpick that. Safely managed sanitation can be broken down into a safely managed service as defined by the JMP. Consists of those 3 elements that I mentioned before. It's either on-site, the combination of off-site, and the 2 different options for on-site, whether the excreta is disposed of off-site or on-site. And typically that relates to the construction of sewers, septics, and dry pits, although there's kind of a bit of a mix of the pits where the pits may be wet or may be dry, but typically dry pits are disposed of on-site. Again, with the JMP data, we can break this out and look at where the kind of mix of the challenges, where the biggest challenge seems to really be this fecal sludge management, where we've got effluent disposed of on-site and sludge disposed of off-site. We do have a significant proportion of waste that's dealt with by sewers, which is effluent and sludge that's dealt with off-site. And then there is, in the blue, we have the pit, the challenge of pit containment. Typically, this is effluent and sludge that's both disposed of on-site. Worthy of note is probably the blue section is underestimated because this is at least basic sanitation. So it doesn't account for toilets that are unimproved, which typically tend to fall in that blue area. So there's quite a bit of work, both in the containment challenges in the blue area, as well as the sludge management for fecal sludge and effluent disposed of on site. On the left side of this diagram, you see the categories that we use for the JMP, and we do have that data on the left side. And as we come across to the right, we have data to be able to break up how much of it is going to sewers, septics, pits, and other. We also know how much of it is unimproved, limited, or no service. And therefore, the challenge of the fecal flow diagrams is to really break out the rest of the diagram to enable us to do two things. One is to arrive at an estimate for how much of the sanitation is safely managed. And then the other is to be able to identify the locus of the risks and to be able to identify where the service chain is broken and the risks and where those risks are being posed. I'm going to run through a couple of case studies, and then I've got a couple of that are not necessarily from the Pacific, and then I'll have a couple of conclusions for the Pacific if you bear with me. First case study is one of Dhaka city in Bangladesh, which is astonishing, where 99.7% of the fecal waste in the city is unsafely managed. Astonishing when you consider that 23% of the city is sewered. The challenge here is basically that everything goes into the stormwater drains and is released into receiving waters. How did this happen? And it really, the building code specifies that waste on-site sanitation should be contained in septic tanks with soakaways. However, the soil, silty, dense soil that can't absorb the moisture. And so what was discovered was that even if you had a septic tank with a soakaway, it couldn't absorb enough of the moisture. And so the soakaways were connected into the stormwater drains. Households then and builders started to discover that you could actually do away with a soakaway and still, the effluent anyway is going into the stormwater drains. And then in this situation, the septic tank starts to operate, once it gets full, it starts to operate like a pipe. And so it's basically just flowing straight into the stormwater anyway. So you can actually do away with the septic tank because it's not really doing anything. There's about 25% of the city on sewers. But the sewers, weren't that popular because when it blocks up, it presents some challenges for the household. It also presents a lot of challenges for the utility. And so over time, the sewers were households were disconnected from the sewers and connected to the stormwater. When I did the assessment, of the 27 sewage pump stations, 26 were turned off. And the houses, and you can't turn off a sewage pump station unless you disconnect the houses from that sewage pump station. The on-site sanitation in the informal settlements, was informally emptied by and dumped into the stormwater drains. And even the formal agreements by NGOs to empty these informal settlements, even though they had agreements to dump into the sewers, there's no point dumping into the sewers because the sewers are turned off. So even the NGOs are dumping into the stormwater drains. And the vision for the informal settlements is basically to try and get onto through smaller networks, to try and get their waste into the stormwater drains via pipes rather than via trucks or informal emptiers. Challenge there is that there's very low political will to change the situation. By and large, there's a great deal of informal satisfaction with the role of the stormwater drains in removing the risk from the city and transferring that downstream. The urban, Thimphu in Bhutan presents another different challenge for the containment of fecal sludge. And again, here with the fecal flow diagram, you see that while about 60% is safely managed, the city has a small sewer, but the major risk is really with the containment step from on-site sanitation. And this is quite a particular, there's some very good elements of the on-site sanitation in Bhutan. Allow me just to run through this. The emptying of sewage is, there's 14% of the population are on sewers. The sewers are quite well managed. The majority of the population within the town are on septic tanks. However, and the septic tanks are frequently emptied. However, they're so frequently emptied because these septic tanks are not actually septic tanks, they're holding tanks. And the way that the perception of a septic tank is in Bhutan is that it is designed that as a holding tank, and the effluent discharge pipe is essentially considered to be an alarm bell. And when you have effluent that overflows from your septic tank into the stormwater drain, it triggers an emptying of the septic tank. Now, that's not how septic tanks are supposed to operate. This is essentially possibly the most inefficient, the most costly, and the most high-risk way of managing effluent, because you are transporting effectively water around the city and discharging it to surface rather than discharging it to soil. The positive side of this system is that these systems are black water only. And so the oversized septic tanks do take between 6 months to a year to 2 years to fill up, but they are just filling up with water rather than with sludge. And the soil is an incredibly good neutralizer of pathogens in effluent, and so there are the options there to improve the the options of expanding soakaways could dramatically improve the management of on-site sanitation in Thimphu. Final case study I'm just going to share is the one for Papua New Guinea, for Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, which is a bit more, rather than the other two cases, it's a bit more complex with having sewers. It's on a percentage of on-site sanitation, and also a considerable portion of dry pit toilets. It's useful in these fecal flow diagrams to separate your wet and your dry components, because the ability to manage dry pit toilets really need to be managed on site. It's very, very difficult to transport dry pit off site. And so it's prudent to try and separate your wet and your dry. The major risks are primarily on containment. There's risks around discharge to stormwater and then to receiving waters. The situation in Port Moresby is about 50% of the population are on sewers and about 50% on-site sanitation, 3% are open defecation on the right there. Within the sewers, there's a very comprehensive system on the coast, but that really only deals with about 5% of the population. The 45% of the population rely on a very old system built in the 1960s that is complicated by an failure to manage the ingress of stormwater, sands, plastic, foods, fats, oils, and greases that really end up with a system that flows between the stormwater drains into the stormwater drains, and then the stormwater drains flow into the sewers. And so you end up with this mixing of stormwater and sewers, both posing a risk to each other, and then inevitably both flowing into what is essentially the same wastewater treatment areas. The septic tanks and fecal sludge management ends up being quite a small percentage of the population that rely on septic tanks. But again, we have very dense silty soil, and so it ends up being a combination of a little bit the Dhaka scenario, where fecal waste goes into stormwater drains, and a little bit the Bhutan scenario, where they're prematurely emptied and transported to these wastewater treatment plants. On the positive side, the plumbing in households in Port Moresby predominantly separates your grey water and your black water. And so in a less than optimal scenario, you can probably maximize the utility of a decaying and overloaded system by reducing the amount of grey water, as well as the amount of stormwater that is loaded on the system, as well as really managing the fogs, your food, your plastics, your sand, and your stormwater. Finally, there's still a significant percentage of the population that's reliant on pit toilets. And really the key to pit toilets, and the challenges with pit toilets is the managing of moisture, and the optimizing of dry pit toilets really relies on the minimizing of moisture. And so, I think, 3 quick reflections for the Pacific, I think, from these 3 case studies. Firstly, on sewers, I really think we need to understand the extent to which sewerage pumps and sewerage pump stations are turned off. And it was really difficult to get to the bottom of that in Dhaka. But with the introduction of smart kilowatt-hour electricity meters, it's quite easy to generate data on whether pumps are turned off or turned on. And it's also generates data enabling us to understand whether pumps are discharging to open, because the load will change on those pumps, whether they're pumping into a rising main or whether they're pumping into receiving waters. The second point, I think, is the importance of the soakaways in neutralizing pathogens. Septic tanks really are a pre-treatment device. The sludge still has to be removed and treated, and the effluent still has to be treated. Soakaways are a fantastic way of neutralizing pathogens, and potentially there are options about how we deal with nutrients, and that is something that can be managed, but it isn't managed in, and it's not addressed by septic tanks. And then the third point is really on countries with a reliance on dry pit toilets. The key to optimizing dry pit toilets is minimizing moisture, which means, as much as possible, siting them in areas which have minimal exposure to high water tables, minimizing the introduction of urine into the pit, and also minimizing the use of water for anal cleansing or the use of water for cleaning of toilets. Thank you, Bronwyn.
Thanks so much, Mark, and great to have kind of your key message for each of the sanitation options there at the end to close. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think now we're going to head to Vanuatu. Hilson Toalu has been working in wash sector for over 25 years, and he's been working with the Vanuatu government, NGOs, and with UNICEF. He retired from UNICEF in 2019, has been involved in WASH consultancy and since then, and is currently working as the National WASH Consultant on the ADB TA Strengthening WASH Practices and Hygiene Behaviour Change in the Pacific. So we'll hand over to you to explain the sanitation situation in Vanuatu. Thank you, Hilson.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and hello everybody listening from across the region. I will be presenting the experiences of citywide inclusive sanitation in Vanuatu, and give you some experiences of this work here in Vanuatu. When I'm saying Vanuatu, it is basically Port Vila that I will be focusing on, not necessarily the whole of Vanuatu, but the city of Port Vila. Next slide, thanks. This is the map of Port Vila. As you can see, it is growing very fast, and in the national census of 2016, the population of Port Vila was found to be 53,944 people living in Port Vila in about 10,965 households. 85% of the household use water-sealed toilets. 15% are reliant on dry pit toilets, mainly in the periphery of Port Vila, in the informal settlements, and 15%, yes, as I've said, are reliant on the dry pit toilets. In the 2016 census, 89% of Port Vila population have access to pipe water, and only 2.3% are reliant on groundwater or river for domestic use and for drinking. Rainwater harvesting also was the type of water that the population are dependent on. So that's sort of giving us the idea of the size of Port Vila and what type of toilet facilities or sanitation facilities are being used by the population in Port Vila. Next slide, Dean. This is the picture of the waterfront of Port Vila. I'm showing this because, as you can see at the background, there is a hotel, which is a tourist resort, and in the bay to the right, unfortunately, I didn't show this in the picture, but there is an island that also has the tourist resort, Ellery Island Resort. And so we have a number of tourist or the hotels along the Port Vila Bay, and also at the back of Port Vila Bay towards the lagoon that have sewage treatment plants, as well as septic tanks for the use by the institutions. Next slide, Dean. Thanks. I want to start with this slide to sort of pave the way for further discussions down. Is that the water quality testing was and is still being regularly carried out at identified locations along the Port Vila Bay, and also at the shores of the first and second lagoon of Aracor by the water monitoring program. And this program is actually supported by the Department of Water Resources against, and the tests are being carried out against microbial classification of recreational waters. So this test is being conducted very regularly, and in 2018, the results show that the threshold levels were, or the results were above the threshold levels and were unsafe for swimming and recreational activities in the Port Vila Bay. So based on these findings, the Department of Water issued a ban for swimming and recreational activities in the Port Vila Bay since 2018, and again in 2020 it was still closed. But this ban was lifted after some improvements in the test reading as late as 2021. So in 2021, the ban was lifted because of the improvements in the test results. Next slide, Dean. As we see in Port Vila, there are three methods of sanitation containment. One is through sewage treatment plants. Second is through septic tanks and pit latrines. Now the containment of contamination risk in Port Vila is from the effluent discharge to the open, or the open, which means land or sea or water, rather than discharge into the soil. So when we are talking about the treatment plants, the primary risk occurs from poorly maintained commercial sewage treatment plants that either routinely or occasionally releases pathogens via effluent to the surface water or to the land. And the second risk, or the which is lower from the first one, is due to septic tank. And this is the secondary risk that occurs from domestic tanks with inadequate soakaways that overflow to the open or discharge effluent to drains, or have the effluent emptied and dumped in the open. That gives that risk. And the third is pit toilets. This is seen as a tertiary risk that occurs from bush toilets, either VIP or pit toilets in storm surge, flood prone and high water table areas where water intrusion discharge pathogens to the surface. So when these pits are inundated, then it discharges pathogens to the surface. Next slide, Dean. This I've mentioned about the risk that are posed by the different types of sanitation facilities. We have here the highest risk is really from the sewage treatment plants discharging into the open, and we have at least 15 sewage treatment plants in Port Vila, but 3 of them are more of high risk. That is the Vila Central Hospital with the 200 beds. Ellery Island Resort I was referring to earlier has 139 rooms, and the Grand Hotel, also referred to earlier, has 72 rooms. Now, they have been designed to, their treatment plants have been designed to effectively treat the effluent and sludge before effluent discharge into the water. But on assessment of these facilities, it was seen that the difficulty here is really the poor maintenance and operation of the sewage treatment plants that do not really treat well the or do not treat the effluent before discharge into the open. So the likelihood of effluent failure is a risk, And this is actually true for all the three establishments I referred to earlier, the three hotels and the hospitals. And then the likelihood of failure to septic sewage treatment plant failure to outfall, it is also true. Even though the Grand Hotel has a maintenance contract, but this still is a likelihood of failure. And then we have the Iririki and the Central Hospital having sludge drying beds, but again, these have failed. So then this we see that the result is effluent, not properly treated, is released into the water. And then we have about 12 sewage treatment plants that discharge into soakaways. And the likelihood of effluent failure is really soakaway overflow to the service. And all these sewage treatment plants, it is true for all these sewage treatment plants where they fail, and it is a risk. And then we have likelihood of sewage treatment plant failure, bypassing of soakaway to service. Yes, we have some of these sewage treatment plants actually are failing in that way, bypassing of soakaway to service. And then the last likelihood is sludge failure to likelihood of sludge failure. All of the sewage treatment plants are at risk of this failure. And although the market house has sludge thickening facilities. So what is being presented here is that although we have all these facilities, but when it comes to poor operation and management, then it presents a high risk to the communities. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So this actually is an issue of operation and management, and the water permits that is being issued is something that would need to be looked at, so that those who apply to operate these systems will have to do them appropriately to minimize the risk of effluent discharge into the open. Next slide, Dean. The next risk is the from the septic tanks, and there are two sort of scenarios presented here. One is a septic tank with the integrated soakaway built around the septic, and the other one is a soakaway built around built separately from the septic. And there are Potwila soil texture is part of the, I think most part of Potwila is sort of gravel earth, and so water can soak away quite easily. But then some parts of Potwila is the soil is sandy, silt, and it is difficult for the water to soak into the soil easily. So here the likelihood of these systems not operating is presented here in the table below in the slides. So if we look at the of course, if septic tanks routinely discharge black water to sewage or storm water in Port Vila, evidence was that cameras were set in the water pipes in the central business district, found no continuous discharge of black water into the pipes. However, this may occur in waterfront hotels or houses that are close to the bay or close to the shore. And then we have another scenario where septic tanks occasionally discharging black water to sewage or storm water. Yes, this is something that if it happens, it occasionally allows pathogens as risk to population. But again, cameras set in the stormwater pipes found very few likely black water overflow pipes in the pipes. So high bacterial in the bay and lagoon after rain, and this confirms some black water overflow. Overloading of soga waste occurs routinely, and soga waste too small, soga waste full of sand and overloaded with gray water and other things is something that provides the burden to the soga waste. And then the emptying of septic tanks. This is a possible pathogen risk, but data from the Bufa septic sewage treatment unit. This is an area where all the sludge and effluent pumped from septic tanks are emptied to into the area, and again, this is something that some of the septic tanks that have low absorptive capacity because of the texture of the soil, most of them emptied too often, and maybe because of the texture of the soil, or the soakaway design is not appropriate, often too small. And the lowest part is the integrated or separate soakaway at risk of polluting the water ground table. This is a low pathogen. There are very few occasions where soakaway is less than 1 meter above groundwater table and less than 15 meters from drinking water sources. So this is a low risk if it happens. Next slide, Dean.
We have about 5 more minutes, Hilson, if we could just finish in 5, and then we'll have time for some discussion. Thanks.
Sure. So the municipal soakaway bylaw is something that would be something to look at to help improve the septic tank situation. Next slide, Dean. I mentioned the dry pit, about less than 15% of households in Port Vila area, and especially confined to suburb of Port Vila, which is black sand, and they have this pit concentration of pit toilets. And as I've said earlier, the risk from the pit toilets is really the overflow or the filling up of the pit toilet by service water or water surge into the pit and overflowing the content to the service ground, or even to groundwater wells nearby. But this is specifically confined to black sands and some in the error core area, which also outside of Port Vila. So although it is there, but it is localized to these areas. Next, in. And the idea is, if this pit toilets are there, but offset pit toilets with the water seal toilets. Next one, Dean. This is the last slide showing the fecal flow diagram for Port Vila, and as you can see, of the 53,000 population, the 2016 census, 69% have safely managed sanitation, and 31% unsafe managed sanitation. The highest risk is to the citizens, and this is where as I mentioned earlier, the effluent discharge to service or to water, and about 16% of this is being estimated here. And the second risk is to a risk to the users, 8%, fecal waste not safely collected, and then risk to environment, it's 7%, sludge not safely emptied. So these are the when analyzing these figures, and the diagram tells us where the biggest risks are discharged into the service. And I have mentioned earlier that this is mainly due to the operation and management of the sewage treatment plants, and the focus here would be to ensure that the establishments operating sewage treatment plants have proper contracts, and also have proper contracts for management and maintenance of the systems, so that they operate properly and they fully operational to meet what they're supposed to be giving to the owners of the establishments. I think that is it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Hilson. And I think if I could invite all of the panelists to please turn on your videos. If we could just stop sharing the slides, I think we can get everyone's videos up on the screen. Thanks, Dean. So there is a flurry of activity in the chat. There's a lot of good questions out there. So a lot of them are focusing in around the technical solutions, and I wondered if you want to start with that, or there's also some really good questions that have come in about how to get access for those poorer segments, poorer quintiles that are obviously the ones missing out the most. I think maybe if we could start with that one. There's a couple of questions there about good case studies. If there are any good case studies of increasing access to sanitation for poorer communities, maybe if we could start with you, Penny. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. First of all, let me just say that every context is different, and you need to start your assessment of the context, and it has to look at not just the technical but social, everything. So I think one size doesn't fit all, as we talked about, but you could look at the ADB has actually published some 3 documents on CWIS. One is looking at financial mechanisms for increasing access to sanitation for the poor. That's on the ADB website. That's worth looking at. And also there's a book coming out soon which is looking at sanitation and water supply in informal settlements in the Asian region. That might be some good case studies. Yeah, I think it's a combination of technology, financial solutions. Yeah, I don't have any specific case studies at the moment, but for example, in South Tarawa, the project is actually providing sanitation to the poorest, building a toilet for them. And there are different ways around subsidies, but again, it depends on the context.
Sorry, muted. Hilson and Mark, did you have any case study examples that might respond to that question in the Pacific? Because the question of informal settlement land ownership and also lack of space has also been raised as contributing to that gap in service.
I have bad examples. The informal settlements in Dhaka, investing in improving sanitation in informal settlements can have the effect of driving poor people out. And the way that works is it drives up the price of rent, as you improve the services. Not unsurprisingly, the cost of renting into these informal settlements goes up with the improvement in services, and it squeezes, and when you do, surprisingly, when you do baseline endline assessments and you don't plot migration of people, it looks as though wealth has increased. Well, it's increased because you've squeezed out the poor people. And so there's a real, real risks in assuming that informal settlements are informal. There's a kind of formality to informality that we need to be careful of. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Is there anything you wanted to add from the Vanuatu context, Hilson?
Thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah. The informal settlements here in Vanuatu, our land tenure is something that does not really help with the sort of infrastructure, because the land is actually owned by the landowners, and if you live or settle on this piece of land and want to improve sanitation, it is a challenge, because the ownership of the land belongs to someone else, and quite often, most of them, they don't really allow their land to be sort of improved. It not only with sanitation, but with electricity and water infrastructure into the area. So informal settlements in Vanuatu is a challenge because of our land tenure.
Yeah. Okay, all agreed on that point. I wondered, there did seem to be quite a lot of discussion about the different sanitation technology options in particular settings. So the question about potential contamination of groundwater came up, and the set away distances that we've discussed before, Mark, and also what's the best solution in atoll areas, high groundwater areas, and difficult to access areas where I guess it's much harder to empty pits if that's the on-site solution that's in place there. Any thoughts? Should we start with the atolls? Because there was also a bit of discussion here about the saltwater sewerage systems. Maybe Mark, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, very happy to. Atoll, and I think in all of these situations about understanding risks. So the 15-metre setback distance that we tend to use is based on 8 days travel at 1.5 metre velocity per day of the lateral groundwater velocity. Now in atolls, rather than 1.5, you may get 1.5 metre per day in Bangladesh, where you've got the whole weight of the water through the Himalayas. But in atolls, you've got millimeters of lateral velocity per day. So, and so in terms of pathogens, the risks are the distances you can reduce. Managing nutrients is a completely different question, as nutrients will, are not attenuated anywhere near as well. And so it really is a case-by-case situation. quickly a segue on saltwater flush. You know, when I first came across it, I thought, how can that be a good system? But actually, you know, when you look at balancing all the risks, you know, like if you get it right, it is, and I think the conclusion from the discussion around Kiribati, South Tarawa, was that really does have a particular place, and it really, you know, like in the menu of options. And so it really does come down to understanding the context and managing risk. There is no risk-free option, as I think Vanuatu shows, with high tech, you know, like being the greatest risk. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Hilson or Penny, did you want to add on the technology solutions?
Yeah, there's a few comments about septic tanks and pit latrines and things. Well, I mean, for Kiribati, for South Tarawa, at the moment, you know, the current septic tanks are in very poor condition. They are open-bottomed. They're not even septic tanks half the time. They're old freezers that have been used, and some of them are holding tanks, like Mark was alluding to in his presentation. So if you can put in a better septic tank, you are improving things. If it's and what's proposed there is these HDPE welded septic tanks, which are very strong and with a proper soak away. So it increases your chances of success. And also we looked at the water supply system. So there is a new system going in, which is a desalinated system, which reduces reliability on groundwater. So you have to factor in all the local context. And sorry, there was one more question someone had about outfalls. In South Tarawa, that is the method of treatment. It's going up to a long outfall. There's no land for fecal sludge treatment or sewage treatment.
Yeah, and the same in the Marshall Islands, from what I understand. Hilson, did you want to add anything, particularly, I guess, around the issue of crowding and lack of difficulty in accessing? Any thoughts on that, particularly as the work around the soakaways that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there are, as I've said, the area around Port Vila, especially in the Black Sands and the Malay area towards the northern side of the city, the informal settlements is sort of concentrated around these areas of Black Sands, and the ground, the soil there is sandy and sort of sandy silt soil, which does not allow the septic soakaway to work well, and so that allows the overflow of septic effluent into onto the surface water. So I think the design of septic tanks is design of septic tanks, and also the soakaways that is being tailored to address different types of soil is something that we need to really look at seriously, and maybe of course the bylaws that the municipal council is looking at will help to address those.
Thanks, Hilson. I can see, Brecht, you have your hand up. You did put a question in the chat. I'm wondering if it's the same question or if you'd like to say your question now. Go ahead. We can't hear anything yet. Feels like you're unmuted though. No, okay. I don't think we have sound for you, sorry. There's a new question that's come in there from Pierre. What does the team consider as appropriate disposal treatment method in small islands where people depend on freshwater lands?
Give me a second to sort out the system.
We'll come back to you, Brecht. This question here is about dependent on the freshwater lens for clean drinking water, and non-water type pits and soakways can contaminate. So again, on groundwater contamination issues.
I'll go if you like. The question is about, where the, again, understanding your lateral velocity, your vertical velocity and your lateral velocities, the first, if your pits are above the soil by 900 mil to a meter, is where the pore clogging interface underneath the bottom of the pit establishes an aerobic layer, which then where the aerobic bacteria can enter and hunt the pathogens below the pits. So citing the best thing to protect groundwater is to ensure a 1 meter or at least 1 meter above the groundwater table. Then if you can't do that, then your lateral velocities and lateral separation distances come into play. And I think it's a whole lot of balancing acts about. Of course, pit toilets, if you are only worried about the risk through the bottom, dry pit toilets are a very good option. But, there's a whole legacy of historic practices for anal cleansing. So, it's all a risk management exercise, and and it can even come to the South Tarawa example of using saltwater flush. There is no silver bullet. It really is about managing risk.
Thanks. And I guess this comes to another point, Mark, that Rosie raised in the chat. What do you do when you don't have that data? So if you don't know the flows in the soil, you don't have the information about where the risks are really quantified. I mean, it's hard to know how much work has gone into collecting data to populate those fecal flow diagrams. I'm assuming huge amounts of work to try and collect that data, or some assumptions. So yeah, what to do in situations where you're trying to prioritize risk, but in a situation that's data poor?
I think it's always dealt with a lack of data, number of pump stations operating, when they operate, that data doesn't exist. And so it's about piecing it together. And so trying to kind of fill the picture. I think, and using proxies, we will never have, so fecal flow diagrams, I think you can start to create them using the JMP data. There's enough to put the back end in, and then you fill in the pieces for the front end. As a proxy, the number of septage trucks in a city gives you a really good indication of what's going on with the shit in that city. So for instance, Dhaka has less than 2 trucks. If you calculate how much fecal waste is generated for Dhaka, you need about 100 trucks for the fecal sludge that should be on site, but it's not on site. Honiara has 11 trucks, but it probably, if you calculate the number of people and the number of shit they generate, it only needs 1. Apia has somewhere around 30 to 40 trucks. It probably needs less than 1. And so once you start doing that, you start realizing, if you have too many trucks, the trucks are transporting effluent. If you have not enough trucks, the effluent is just going to receiving waters. It's getting out of systems. And so it's always, I think proxies enable you. And one other thing is that I think there was a question about what do you do in a situation like Dhaka? And I think the key is not to let the best be the enemy of the good. You know, you have stormwater drains that are effectively working like a stormwater sewer. It's getting to an outfall. Can you treat it at the outfall? It's not ideal. You know, cities are trying to move away from stormwater sewers, but no one, having disconnected from a sewer, no one's going to reconnect to a sewer, you know, because you put in, you know, millions of dollars to upgrade the pumps and the treatment plant. Septic tanks with open bottoms. I think it's not ideal, but it's not the greatest risk. You know, we can, you know, like once you get the pore clogging at the bottom, you know, it poses less risk than the risk to surface. And so I think we've got to kind of, while it's, you know, question of, you know, the best being the enemy of the good, we've just got to manage those risks and try and manage them.
Thanks, Mark. I think there's a lot more discussion and questions we haven't been able to address. I know there was one on land issues, and there's also another one on nature-based solutions. So thank you for those questions. I'm afraid we are out of time, and we're going to hand to Carl Galling from ADB to close now. Thank you so much for joining, and special thanks to our panelists as well. Over to Carl.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm very pleased with the interaction we had today in this webinar. And we acknowledge all the questions you had in the chat box, and we'll endeavor and try to get back to you on all these questions, especially those that haven't been answered, and we'll find a way to do that offline. And that's a promise. Let me just share a few takeaways as we wrap up the webinar. I'll start with the message on the importance of evidence-based sanitation planning and implementation. Evidence on sanitation systems, as we've heard, is essential to understand failures and successes and risks to human and environmental health. We've also heard about the availability of practical tools that we could use and applying them to choose on the best interventions and options. We've heard from Mark and the other presenters about fecal flow diagrams, how they help quantify safely managed versus unsafely managed sanitation in a given urban area, which in turn would help us prioritize these interventions. Thirdly, I think we've heard from the speakers about the use of conventional infrastructure versus applying innovative solution. And it's normally either or solutions that we've considered in the past, but it's actually, we see that traditional infrastructure solutions alone are rarely sufficient to address sanitation needs for all, and that's for all users and context. The sanitation needs of all citizens need to be considered, and that would include the rich and the poor, all genders and abilities, formal and informal settlements, as many of you mentioned, but also recognizing that the adoption of these holistic approaches would require incremental development. Another message is on the sanitation service chain and the need to assess the whole sanitation service chain from containment, collection, transport, treatment, disposal, and reuse of waste and adequate arrangements considered for effective delivery of services. Broadening the menu for on-site sanitation is another takeaway, and well-managed on-site options, as Mark has underlined, including improved pit latrines, septic tanks, and soakaways, must be on the menu of options. And lastly, very important message is on sustainable services. Citywide Inclusive Sanitation works to build the enabling environment covering institutional capacity, accountability, financing mechanisms, and political leadership to sustain these services. So I think those are the key takeaways from my side. I enjoyed this webinar. And in closing, I think before we get off the webinar, I'll encourage everyone to turn on their cameras for our picture taking. Over to you, Dean. Thank you.